part of our job this evening, as we see it, is to help generate both information for all of you, but to draw you into a conversation about the left in Europe and its experiences and what lessons we in America might usefully draw from that. And there really could be very few people better than Walter Baier here to do this. Walter is the editor of a journal. There are copies of it out front. It's called Transform. How many years has it been coming out?
7.
7 years. And it is a journal that puts together the perspectives, the thinking, and the experience of the left parties that form the left in the European Parliament. It is therefore, how many countries involved?
In the European Parliament, there are 17 parties of 12 countries.
Okay. And they have elections that bring these left representatives into the European Parliament. And this is the journal in which they talk to each other, in which the left in Portugal informs the left in Turkey, which talks to the left in Norway, and so forth and so on, about what they're doing, what is working, what is not working. It's a very sophisticated operation. It unites all these parties. It constitutes an ongoing dialogue amongst them that is also involved in coordinating their activities. I hope that Walter, either on his own or in response to questions I ask him, or questions and comments that you are invited to make as we go along. We do not want this to be simply a presentation. We would like it to be a conversation that we can all participate in, but I hope that Walter tells us something about the different left parties and organizations in Europe that are allied in and responsible for producing collectively this journal and the ongoing relationships to them. For my part, let me simply say, I just came back. I spent a month in Europe, most of the last month. I came back this weekend. And I'm just going to relate two things that happened to me that relate to the left. First, I tried to contact friends of mine in Greece, but I couldn't do it last Thursday because Greece was having its, I don't know, umpteenth general strike of the last, and everything stopped in Greece. I mean, everything. I couldn't reach my friends because they couldn't get in and out of the city of Athens because the transportation was stopped. I mean, there is a very active struggle involving tens of thousands of people in Greece. That's a left that has power. That's a left that has impact. That's a left that's organized. That is something we ought to know about. And it is something that most of the American media either ignore or treat very marginally and misreport even when they do that. The second event was in Paris, and I attended a meeting about 10 days ago at which all 6 of the national trade union associations, there are 6 of them in France, and they don't normally cooperate very well together for various reasons that have to do with history, but they were all cooperating, and at this meeting they were all extremely excited because they reached a decision to all cooperate on a general strike on the 7th of September in all of France. And they were working out which trains would run at the meeting. And the only trains that would run would be the trains that were taking strikers and demonstrators from one part of France to another. But nobody else would get on the train because they wouldn't be permitted. And to be present at that meeting for me as an American is an arresting experience. And let me conclude by telling you about the building in which I met and sat in on this conversation. It is the building of one of the left organizations in Paris. It's in a very big central square in the city of Paris, in the northeastern corner of Paris. It's an office building. It's about 6 stories high, runs about what we would call here half a block, full of offices and meeting rooms where we had this conversation and where there are offices of simultaneous translation in the back of the room. this is a left political organization. There must have been 200 people working in that building doing the work of organizing the daily newspaper that they produce in France, the trade union organizations that are based there, the people's organization. It's an arresting experience about the power of the left, which is not to suggest it doesn't have problems and conflicts and crises galore. It does. But it is a different thing from here, from the United States. And I think that part of what we want to do tonight is explore that and see what lessons we can draw from it. So to get us going, I'm going to ask a couple of questions of Walter in order, let him respond, and then hopefully that will draw us in to a conversation about where the left is in Europe, what is happening, what its activities are, what its problems are, to the general, hopefully the general benefit of bringing that experience to help us in the United States to build the kind of left that we need to make the changes here. So let me begin introducing Walter, first of all, to you, and inviting him to add any biographical information that he might beyond what I've said, and to ask him the following. Here in the United States, as in Europe, the economic crisis that burst upon global capitalism in the year 2007 is now in its third year. And it has produced enormous problems and difficulties, both in the United States and in Europe. It has driven, in Europe, for example, governments into such levels of debt that they literally cannot maintain themselves. And so much of Europe is involved right now in a struggle in which governments, north, south, east, and west, are talking and coordinating the imposition of what they call in Europe austerity, in order to placate all of the banks and all of the lenders around the world that they had to go borrow money from to try to cope with the crisis in the last 3 years. They now have discovered in many European countries, many, Greece is only the tip of the iceberg, that those lenders are not willing to keep these loans going and are saying to the European governments, you borrowed from us, you got to enjoy this now with me, you borrowed from us, the banks, in order to rescue us from the disaster we produced. So you borrowed from us and from our clients to rescue us. So now you owe us because you borrowed from us. And you have to pay us more because we don't think you're a very reliable borrower. So here's what we need to do. You need to prove to us that we ought to keep lending to you, renewing the old loans and lending you new loans. And in order for you to assure us that it's safe, we got to see that you have put aside more money to pay us back. So you either have to tax your people more, get more money, or stop spending on social programs to put that money aside to make sure that it's there to pay us, your creditors. So the governments are beginning to look around and are figuring out who to tax and who to cut programs on in order to pay back the money that was borrowed to bail out the financial sector that provoked the crisis. And all across Europe, the population is reading in the newspaper and following on television the discussions of their leaders about how to raise what kind of taxes and how to cut back spending. When I was in Greece a month ago to give some talks, it happened just by coincidence to be the week that the government took its first step. So the professors who had invited me in Athens came to me with long faces the day I was there and showed me what had happened to their paycheck. Universities in Greece are mostly public, and so they are public employees. Their paychecks had been cut between 15 and 20% for the year, beginning that week. And the government said there's a good chance that in October another cut will come. So I want to make it as stark as possible. There are cutbacks everywhere, but we're talking about major reductions in the standard of living of working people, starting with public employees, that is provoking those very general strikes in Greece and the planning for those in France that I talked about. So I'd like to begin by asking Walter if he could tell us a little something about this economic crisis and how it has galvanized, affected the left in Europe, to give us some sense, both of the left and where it is right now.
Yes, thank you, Rick, for the introduction. And what I learned during which are at the first 12 months working are culturally different. And at the same time, things are quite similar. And I would say that in a certain sense, you could say that the strategic content of the struggle in Europe, which is waged by the ruling class by exploiting the crisis, has to do with a social and political model which is already in fact here in the United States. If you look at the strategic content of the struggle in Europe now, you can say one of its main goals is to get rid of the social and the welfare state, which is the result of a more than 100-year ongoing class struggle in Europe. As everywhere in the world, in the capitalist world, the crisis started 3 years ago with the crisis of the real estate sector in the United States. Then it arrived at the real economy, and now it touched public expenditure and turned out to be a crisis of the public debt of a couple of European states. What they actually said, and here I agree completely with the description you gave, is you have to spend too much money within the last years, mainly to bail out the banks, and now you have to take the money away from the people. And what they additionally say, it's because you, as the Greeks, you are lazy, you are not working enough, you are not paying your taxes, you are not working efficiently enough, and that's why. But if this were true, you could not explain why the same sort of program is not imposed on Portugal and Spain. Well, and then people say, well, this is the Mediterranean Europe, and they are as the Greeks are. But if this were true, you could not explain why the same sort of program is imposed on Denmark and the Netherlands, and why it's imposed on France and in Great Britain. And actually, it has nothing to do on the first side with public debt. It has to do with a very serious attack on the social state, which is part of the reality in Europe and had been part of this reality within the last 50 years at least. And I say this in brackets that this is the economic challenge. And I would guess that on the political level, the challenge consists in the endeavor of the ruling class to establish in Europe a sort of bi-party system with the effect to marginalize the existing radical political left, which is institutionalized in Europe, is represented in parliaments, sometimes goes to government, which is not such a successful experience so far. Sometimes it is in coalition with the social movement, opposing the programs of the governments and the ruling classes. However, it is one factor of the relation of power, and they want to get rid of it. And the challenge for the European left now is to understand that the resistance which we wage, of course, has to be rooted in the different societies in Greece, in France, in Denmark, in Austria, in Germany, and elsewhere. But at the same time, it has to have a European dimension. What the left has to understand that at the end of the day, the composition of the relation of power is not made up in the different countries, and the relation of power then is the result of the different relations of powers in the countries alone. What the left has to understand, that we have to create a relation of power, a balance of power on the European level. And this, of course, is very complicated because you have a left which is fragmented, which differs in terms of social, cultural traditions, which differs, of course, in terms of languages, and which differs in terms of ideological orientation. You have a social democratic left, you have a green left, you have a communist left, you have a left socialist left, you have a left green left, and all these has to come together in a relatively short period of time. If we were able to unite these different forces, and if we were able to create and generate an alternative strategy for Europe, then I think the left could get out as a stronger force as it is at the moment on the European level.
Let me try to pick up on this and take it another step. If I understood Walter correctly, then he is saying that the worst crisis of capitalism since the Great Depression has been utilized by those who produced it and whose system is in crisis to allow them to further their own agenda at the expense of everybody else. So instead of paying for the crisis gives them new opportunities and new means for advancing a program to weaken their political and ideological enemies and to strengthen the shape of an economic system to allow them to continue. Have I understood you?
Yes, you understood me rightly. I would word it maybe a bit differently. I would say that theoretically speaking, crisis always had not been only the effect of class relations, it always had been a means of class struggle from above. And of course people are scared by the crisis. If you work in a steel factory and you see day by day that the work becomes less and less, and you know the mill is going for 3 weeks, for 2 weeks, you are in a position in which you react defensively. And this now is utilized in the most brutal and in the most cynical way by the ruling classes. And it's even worse than that, because the saying that we are in the deepest crisis since the 30s actually is true, and at the same time we are in a crisis which consists not only of an economic and social crisis, it is an ecological crisis, it is a political crisis, it is a crisis of the global relations. We as Europeans, and also as Europeans left, have to be aware of the fact that as a result of the crisis, the real power, the economic and political power of Europe in the world will diminish. Europe will play a less strong role than it used to have played, and that many of the European politicians think they still play. So we are in a world of a dramatic upheaval, and this all comes now together. For the individual, this gives a situation in which you could really be scared because of all these things which are going on. And for the left, it creates a situation in which it has to rethink fundamentally its strategic orientations. Of course, we are for the defense of the welfare state and of the social state, but at the same time, we cannot defend the social and the welfare state at the expense of the ecological environment in which we are in. So we have to do at least two things at the same time. We have to defend the welfare state, we have to defend the jobs, and at the same time to create programs in order to restructure the economy in ecological terms. Or if you look at the social state, it comes out from the traditional 40s class compromise, which was agreed between the ruling classes and the working classes. But as a matter of fact, and we have to admit this, it was partially at the expenses of the environment, at the expenses of social groups which were excluded. For example, the women's work, which is underrated in Europe still. You have a wage gap between men and women between 20 and 30%, different in different countries, but this is the average. And that means that all these contradictions now become contradictions which the ruling classes may use in order to break the resistance of their traditional opponents, so as the trade unions. And we have to be frank about this. Of course, this is still impressing the influence of the trade unions, but in France, they altogether represent less than 10% of labor. In Austria, as an example of a very high degree of organization, they still represent 40%, but 80% of these 40% are in public sector. In the private companies, you have a dramatically decreased influence of the trade unions. And if the trade unions want to regain ground, they have to understand that they represent only a part of labor, that a big part of labor works under precarious conditions, out of formal contracts, which they traditionally do not represent. They have to understand that they have to take up the demands of the women's movements, of the social movements. So the question is that in the midst of this crisis, we have to generate resistance, we have to create alternatives, and at the same time, we have to restructure our mindsets in order to be able to resist efficiently.
Let me just hold a couple more and then we'll open it up more. Walter, I think it would help people in the room, and I don't mean to ask you to do an exhaustive thing, but to give us some idea of the relationship between the trade unions on the one hand, the leftist political parties on the other hand, and where they stand in Europe relative to public opinion in general, in order to help us ground the framework in Europe and to understand how it's different from our situation here. It would help us to have, and obviously not every country, but maybe a Mediterranean country and Germany and one other, so we get a sense of how the left works in its units and how it relates to the larger population.
Well, you can distinguish in the trade union reality at least between three models. One model is a trade union movement structured alongside the different branches of industry and public sector, but mainly unified, meaning you have one trade union center as you have it in Germany, and then you have within this frame the different trade unions representing the labor force in one of the industrial branches. The steel workers, the private employees, the workers in the communal, municipal enterprises, and so on and so forth. This is the one model, and this is the German model. And you have, of course, inside the trade union, people of different orientations. You can generally say that the trade unions stood under the hegemony of the Social Democratic Party, but as the Social Democratic parties, when they were in government, decided to promote the neoliberal programs, the trade unions set apart, and parts of them opened the door for a cooperation, for a debate, for a unity in different actions with other left forces and with the left. This is one of the models. The Mediterranean model, and the same goes for the French trade union movement, is that you have trade unions differently attributed to political parties. You have in France the big overwhelming trade union, the CGT, which used to be close to the Communist Party. Now it's less than it has been before because it claims more independence. You have the CFDT, which traditionally was close to the Social Democratic Party. You have in Italy a trade union which is close to the Christian Democratic Party. And that's why that what you reported from France is so important for the trade unions and for the left as a whole, that if in these circumstances the trade unions, although their proximity to different parties is still a fact, are able to agree on joint actions, this has, of course, influence on the political parties as well, because they have to take into account how the debates develop in the different trade unions. So this is the Mediterranean model. And then you have models, particular in countries in which the left is weak, that the trade unions, although they are formally and juridically independent of any party, more or less follow the social democratic agenda. This goes for the most of the Scandinavian countries, this goes for Austria and other ones. And then I forgot this to mention, and this is one of the mistakes which is characteristic for Western European intellectual and leftists, that I forgot to mention the trade union situation in the former socialist countries of Eastern Europe. There you have the average situation in these countries is that the trade union movement is weak, although it remains the main stronghold of the alternative forces in the societies. And some of them are able to mobilize large masses of people. We saw a big demonstration a couple of months ago in Romania, 60,000 people showing up at the central square of Bucharest, which is, under the political circumstances of this state, really a very courageous step of the trade unions, but at the same time, they are still in a defensive position. So you cannot compare the situation in Eastern Europe with that one in the other countries, and which I was describing. But what is true for all these three former cases, namely the German, the Mediterranean, and the Scandinavian model, is that all these trade unions are under a particular pressure. And it's not easy. Although the mobilization in Greece is tremendous, and we saw a big demonstration a couple of weeks ago in Lisbon of 300,000, 400,000 people. We saw 10,000 out of the streets in Madrid a couple of weeks ago. Although this is true, it is also a fight for the survival of the trade unions. If they are able to withstand and to survive under these conditions, then they have gained a big victory, and that is one of the strategic goals of the ruling classes, to get rid of the trade unions, to break their influence in societies.
Could you say something about the relationship of the population as a whole in European countries to the trade unions and the left parties, to give us some sense of what the population as a whole, difficult as that is, how it sees and relates to trade unions and left-wing political parties? Are they a very minor fringe, or are they an integral part of the society? That kind of question.
Well, of course, in the most of the European countries, the trade unions are regarded as an integral part of the societies. And if you were asking people out on the streets if they think that trade unions are a good thing, most of them would say yes, they are a good thing. But if you ask the same peoples In the factories, for example, if they would go out for a strike under the leadership of a certain trade union, the proportion of people which could be mobilized is less. So the trade unions benefit from a social capital which they accumulated during the last decades. But their position is difficult because of a couple of reasons. First reason is that the social structure of the society has changed. The ordinary, average European trade union represents the blue-collar male working class. They have difficulties to integrate migrants. They have difficulties to integrate female. They, of course, do not represent people in precarious conditions. Even if they say we want to get rid of precarious working conditions, they do not represent these people because they say to them, we want to get rid of the conditions of work in which you are in, but we do not defend you in the concrete struggles and situations in which you are in. So the social basis of the trade unions is diminishing. Second point is, and that has to do with technological changes in the world of labor. We live in societies in which labor is diminishing, and as the trade unions were not able to achieve a substantial reduction of labor time, they are confronted with a growing mass employment, which exercises a permanent pressure on the trade unions. And thirdly, they are now confronted with the crisis and with the fear of a lot of people. Of course, if you mobilize people, you can mobilize 1 million of French in Paris, but the relation in the street differs from the relations in the workplaces, because in the workplaces, it's the question, you go, and you stay. Who stays? What are the conditions under which I agree with changes in the working conditions? And you have this drama, for example, in France, with the series of suicides of employees, qualified people which were bullied for months and months in order to get rid of them, and who committed suicide because they are in despair. They feel isolated, marginalized, and this is a very complicated situation of the trade unions, and that's why I regard it as so courageous and so important that they now take these kind of steps which you described, because there is no other way out than to try to mobilize. But the result of the struggle is an open question still.
Let me ask one last, and then we open it up. Walter said an interesting thing a few minutes ago. He said it would be a great victory for the unions and the left if they were able to come through this very difficult period, having successfully defended, let's say, the working class against this agenda of putting the costs of the crisis on them and using the crisis as an opportunity to break their institutions, their union. I don't want to question that, but it is a victory describing, or a victory if you like, about a defensive strategy. Traditionally, it has also been at least as much a part of the left agenda, not only to defend the working class against the attacks of a system, but also to have a positive agenda for social change that will improve the condition of the working class. Let's call it an offensive agenda alongside of its defensive agenda. So I wonder if Walter is saying that at this point there's no time, space, or possibility for an offensive agenda, that the whole focus of the left and the trade union has to be defensive. Or whether I have misheard him, or there is a positive further transformation of society that is also part either of the trade union or of the political parties on the left.
Yes, sure. I think this is the crucial point of the debate. Firstly, I would say that regarding the relation of power on the political level, on the social level, and on the cultural level, we have to admit that we are in a defensive position. No illusions about that. At the same time, and this is, if I understood you rightly, was the point which you made, there will not be a success in defensive unless we are able to develop an offensive picture, an offensive strategy. Or I could say it in different words which may describe the problem more precisely. The point is, if the trade unions stick with a defensive agenda saying we defend our workplaces, we defend our social state, they will be defeated. No question about it, because this does not represent the majority of the populations in Europe. So the question is, are the trade unions capable to link the defense of the welfare state with an idea of restructuring the welfare state, the society, and the technological basis of our societies? Or thirdly said, I think that all European societies are at the same time in a situation of a fierce class struggle waged by the ruling classes, but encounter also the need of a cultural and psychological change of societies. Most of the European states, for example, are based on the idea of the national state. But this is a fiction. It always has been a fiction, and it is today all the more a fiction, as in all our society. Large communities of migrants work, live, not having the same cultural and social and political rights. So we have to adopt an understanding of multicultural and multi-ethnic political living together of people, which is quite unusual to the most of the European societies. And by the way, the conflicts arising from the existence of large migrant communities is one of the points in which the extreme right mobilizes and gathers people. So neither as a political party nor as a trade union you can avoid this kind of confrontation with the right. Although racism and racial segregation of the European society is an integral part of the right agenda and also of the common sense of large populations which the trade union actually represent. So they have to change. And the same goes for the ecological questions. Of course, hundreds, thousands of jobs in Germany depend on the car industry. The other day, I met the former finance minister of Ecuador, discussing with him on the question of auto industry. And he said to me, well, you know, your auto industry is in a difficult situation, but you underestimate the difficulty when you think that the difficult situations of your auto industry has to do with ecological questions. Of course it has to do with ecological questions, but the autos which will be manufactured within the next 20 or 30 years, they will not be manufactured in Europe, in Germany. They will be manufactured in China, in Russia, and in Brazil. And this is your problem. So how to deal as trade unions with this problem? And not to speak too longly, but I would say that this, by the way, shows that if you look on the social and cultural and political situation of our societies only from the point of view of the trade unions, then this is too narrow. You have to look at it from the point of view of the political alternative. It has to do with parties. It has to do with the capabilities of parties to develop projects which are credible in order to start a change which consists in defending on that what has to be what has to be defended, but at the same time explaining to people, you Europeans, you will not live in the year 2020 in the same time as you were used to live in the year 1995. And this is the real intellectual, psychological, and political challenge before the European left. And I say this quite frankly, and I say this also in the European context, and I know some of my friends don't hear that with an emphatic feeling. But if the political left was not able to adopt this combination of defense and psychological and cultural change, it will disappear, and the ruling class will achieve their second goal, which I mentioned before, namely establishing a two-party system in which the remainers of former radical parties then play a role as a left wing of big social democratic parties. Maybe some of them are then in governments, others are not, but this to defend the political independence of a radical left trend in the labor movement and in the political movement presupposes the capability to develop a cultural and political independence and intellectual independence in portraying a society of the year 2020.
Okay, let me open it. I mean, there's many more things I would add, but let us try to bring more of you in. Please feel free to make a comment on what you've heard, to ask a question. I'll try not to have it be too much question answer and try to make it more of a open-ended discussion, but you know, I'm not sure how well I can do that. But yeah, go ahead. Why don't you start? One thing, because of the air conditioner, it might, if you wouldn't mind coming here, it'll be easier for people to hear what you have to say. Sorry, but I think it'll work better that way. Thank you.
I have two interrelated comments. Hopefully the latter can be slightly more constructive. Both of you tentatively characterized, the 2007 crisis as potentially the most devastating since the Great Depression. Perhaps so, but I think we would need to add the qualifier that this would be the case only if we actually consider the context of the United States and Europe. I mean, of course, if we consider the economic situations in the rest of the world, austerity was the banner under which much of structural adjustment policies were forced upon the governments for many a decade at this point. So I do think that looking at how unions and leftist political organizers in those countries have combated those policies can potentially be helpful. You of course added that in addition to the current crisis being perhaps the largest, you said there were new dimensions such as ecological and political. I mean, maybe it's unfair, maybe you meant this just as a side note, but when you say that this could potentially mean an overall decrease of the power of Europe as a region on the international scene, to me that seems less important an issue. Now, moving on to the second comment and question, I think you invoked the cultural and the changing demographical situation of Europe, namely growing multiculturalism and the challenge this poses for constructing a positive offensive agenda on the left. Now, as you commented before, though, trade unionism as we know it was entrenched, built on top of the Fordist Accord. And this actually meant that at the time, labor, at least organized big labor, had a relative strength vis-a-vis capital because the state was mainly interested in immunizing the original zone of conflict. I'm not so sure that trade unionism could boast this level of power, especially since I think we far moved away from the Fordist structure of the economy to a post-Fordist structure. So in this sense, I personally think that it would be more fruitful to think about the new terrains upon which we need to think about organizing in terms of the new economic structures, perhaps in addition to the kind of cultural and ethnic dimensions that you spoke about.
No, let's collect.
Well, let's have two or three more and then let Walter kind of Sir.
I would like to bring up two contemporary successes of the European left. One, namely the success of the Green or left parties at the last elections for the European Parliament, after which Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who was one of the leading Green Party members, stated that maybe the future of the left in the European Union in general would be a decentral organization that is essentially, post-trade union, post-centralized organizations, and more contemporary, maybe modern. And I would like to hear maybe your comment on this matter. And secondly, another successful left political movement is the Left Party in Germany, which has been definitely in the offense for the last 5 to 10 years maybe. And however, if you look at their political actions with regards to the last election of the German president, they have essentially failed to cooperate, or maybe it always takes two to tango, but the mainstream left and the left party in Germany haven't been able to cooperate in order to oppose the election of a right-wing president. And I would like to hear your comments on that, specific matter. Thank you.
How about one more, and then we give the floor back to Walter. Yeah, in the back.
I wonder if you could discuss the issue of migration and the role of migration. And if you go to Greece, northern Greece, southern Greece, whatever, we see people coming from the north, people coming from the south, and in France, Italy, Scandinavia, and so on. Migration has been, if I understand correctly, has been resisted. Illegal immigration has been resisted by the trade union movement, but many of the borders have become very porous, and it looks as if that is one of the techniques which is used to weaken the trade union movement, not only in Europe, but also in the USA.
Yeah. Well, I'm an Austrian, and I'm working for a European structure, and in that European structure, which is independent of a party, we usually do not comment on party decisions. So I say you very openly and directly my personal opinion. And my personal opinion is, if the Social Democrats and the Greens in Germany would have wanted to have a joint candidate with the Linke, then they should have negotiated with them. And the idea that left parties mainly have the function to organize the support for that, what social democratic or green parties decide, this does not work anymore in Germany. And this is an achievement, and it's a democratic achievement. If they want to have left unity, which I am for, and that's why I'm so disappointed about that, what happened in Saarland and what happened in North Rhine-Westphalia, then they have to negotiate with them as partners. Question of political culture, and I say this, by the way, because we have had this debate in Austria too. Look at the left in Germany. They prevented a left candidate to win over the right winger. It failed the whole German left to do so, and it's not the responsibility of one of its components. Firstly. Secondly, and in this way I agree with you, I think the left in Europe in the 21st century will be not national state based, it will be not a centralized left. It will be a pluralistic left, which is obvious in a situation in which a continent or a political structure consists of 30, 35 or 50 nations with very different political traditions. It will be a networking left. It will debate on equal footing with the social movements, including, by the way, renewed trade unions. I think trade unions will play a decisive role in the future as they are organized and institutionalized mass movements, but they have to change profoundly. I mean, there is a lot of debate on multiculturalism in Europe, and the green and the liberal and the left debate on how they can organize this joint living together. But the fundamental point of view is that Europe is part of a global system in which the societies in which 20% of the overall population of the world live consume 80% of the resources. And of course, this has to do with distribution among classes and is subject to class struggles, but it's also a side of the truth, because traditionally they used not to live so badly under these conditions. And this is a part of that, what you quoted at the 40th class accord. Of course, this was a class accord on the expense and to the detriment of the overwhelming majority of the people. And what we try to explain is that this, of course, is a moral question, but more and more it becomes a question of real politics to understand that the world does not work further in this way. And if you have these people now approaching the European borders and the European coast, and a lot of them are killed when they approach the coast. What the right says is, we could continue living as we lived before if we get rid of these people. If we can keep our fortress, if we can blackmail the rest of the population with nuclear superiority, you, white, male, blue workers at least, can live as you lived before. Maybe you have to accept 20% less wage, but generally you can do so. And what the left has to explain is this complicated double message, namely, firstly, you have to defend your interests, and secondly, you have to accommodate with the fact that you will not live as you lived before. You have to change, you have to change your mindsets, your values, what's really you have to detect again what's really relevant in life. And it's not how much you consume and how sophisticated the things are which you use. But this has to do with change, and this is psychological change, and this is very complicated. And by the way, I would say that although I have to put a lot of criticisms on the Greens, but that's their message, or one of their messages, that they draw attention to the fact that there are ecological limits of the way in which we are living. And the left has to take up this message and to combine it with its social agenda. So I think that in a Gramscian way, the big challenge is if the left is capable to synthesize these different aspects of contradictions in which we are in. And at the end of the day, this political force will be able to contribute to human progress, which can contribute to this synthesis, either in being capable to theoretically synthesize it, which I regard as one of the challenges of contemporary Marxism, or to be prepared to connect with movements which exist outside of the own intellectual and cultural territory. And that's why I think we were debating before if we are living in interesting or more dangerous times. And if I would advocate that we are living in interesting times, I would point to this fact that this is culturally and intellectually such a huge challenge, which our generation can maybe formulate this question, but the next generation will really have to take it up.
If I could just add one thing, that there's a kind of rule in circles of international investment. If you do not permit the immigrants to come in, then the capital will leave and go where those immigrants came from. That the way capitalism organizes economic development is to move in the direction of making more money by exploiting lower wage workers. And it doesn't really care where that is. So either you bring the cheap workers here or we'll invest over there. Either way, the mass of workers are going to take it on the chin. Or to say the same thing another way, as the first questioner asked, if the center of economic production is being moved out of Europe and North America to Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and there's plenty of signs that that's happening, and if it's being organized by capital, moving its production to these areas to take advantage of all the reasons we know, then it is likely to be the plan of capital to make this extra money and to drop the mass of hitherto well-paid workers into the same conditions that in the third world have been there for so long. Why would we expect anything else? So the prognosis for European and American workers, if they don't do something, is awful, is a sinking down to the conditions of the others as the center of production moves to China, to India, and so forth. And that adjustment, which is in the interests of capital, leaves the mass of workers in the formerly developed part of the world to a slow or not so slow decline. And really what Walter is saying is that's the issue. How's the left going to deal with that situation, both nationally and internationally? You know, in Europe, when the unification of Europe happened, and especially now with the integration of Eastern Europe, the issue was no longer Europe united or not, but whose unification? What kind of unification? Unification for whom? And the same question could be asked as we relocate geographically production in the world, as we bring into the center of the world economy areas that were formerly subordinated and peripheral. How will that be organized? How will the fruits of all of that be distributed? And in a sense, that's what he's saying is the urgent issue for the Europeans to have a positive program and not just a defensive position. I would like to say, just as a point of fact, if you add together the Socialist Party in Germany vote the last election, and the Green Party and the Left Party, that's half the people of Germany. And we're not talking the United States. That's half the voting is socialist, green, or left of socialist. 1 out of 8 German people voted for the new Left Party that takes a position to the left. 1 out of 8 Germans voted for them. You know, in Portugal, what does the Communist Party normally get?
10%.
10% of the vote.
A quarter voted for the left in Portugal.
You know, and in many of the countries, the left has a long established tradition where significant percentages of the people vote for them, always. There's a base there. It's very important to understand, with all the problems, that is the case there. It's not the case here. Sir.
Good evening. I heard the presentation and I thought about the whole sketch of what the left, European left looks like, the way that you presented it. I know the left has had internationally has had a dynamic and very profound, complex history. As I understand it, the task of the left had been to to educate the workers, educate the proletariat for the purpose of overthrowing capitalism and overthrowing the capitalists to create a different system, a different society that would not look like anything capitalist. Socialism, communism, and so on. And in the talk tonight, I really heard nothing about that. I think it would be interesting to have a definition of what is left today. What's left of the left today, and what is the left today? As we consider what it is that they should really be fighting for. I didn't hear anything about revolution. I didn't hear anything about the proletariat. What is the role of the proletariat today? And it seems to me today, as much as we know of the wealth of experience of class struggle throughout the centuries, I would like to know, is there any Marxist-Leninist parties that are really addressing the issue of class organizing, organizing the proletariat, organizing the workers for revolution, to change the system, to overthrow the capitalist system? I haven't heard anything about that tonight, so maybe you could clarify this issue.
I was wondering if you might discuss debt. We talked about national debt. Clearly an issue in America we're all very familiar with, myself included, is personal and household debt. And the relationship that personal and household debt has to the increasingly impoverished status of the worker in Europe, as we all know it does in America. I actually read in MR Zine this week a very interesting piece that was talking about recapitalizing the worker. Insofar as the bank recapitalizes itself by increasing interest rates and so forth, that the worker might recapitalize the working class by refusing to pay back debts. I was wondering, since this a large part of this crisis is clearly financial, although it's just representative of the ever-increasing desire to reinvest the surplus, which is becoming increasingly difficult in the productive sector. What's the role of household debt and all that?
All right. Basically, let's say the questions, I had the same question as he did about what is going on in organizing for a revolution and for changing society so that's not organized on the basis that we find ourselves fighting on today. But also, I recognize I've also heard you, Rick, speak before about alternative ways to organize our economies and strategies for workers, for unions and these trade unions to be looking towards as taking ownership, creating cooperatives, creating workers' co-ops, consumer co-ops, and a structure that's outside of what the profit motive and capitalism today organizes around. And looking towards that as an alternative, or other alternatives to the structure that capitalism now offers us, which is either these austerity measures or drop in standard of living significantly.
Yeah. Yes, firstly, on this question, what is the European left about? This is really a difficult question. Even in empirical terms, because it depends on what left you are talking about. Let aside that there is a social left consisting of the trade unions and the social movements. Let aside that there is a cultural left consisting of educational movements, of famous artists, only talking on the political left. And once again, let aside that there are social democratic parties, and this is difficult because these social democratic parties in many cases are divided So you cannot easily say this is a party of this or that type. In some of these parties exist controversial currents. And let aside the Green Party. So we are talking on the left of the left, which came up more or less historically after the First World War and the October Revolution. Actually, you can say that this left in Europe is fragmented in 4 parts. One part adheres to a Trotskyist, Maoist heritage, and I say this as neutral as possible, because I understand that many of the questions traditionally raised between the left currents are obsolete with the breakdown of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. So just to denote the traditions of which they are coming from. The most prominent example of this is the new anti-capitalist party in France, which is at the presidential elections, I think about 8%, and at the European elections got 3.5 or something, and actually it's not represented neither on the national nor on the European level. The second part of it belongs to a Marxist-Leninist, traditional Orthodox current, mainly represented by the Communist Party of Greece and the Communist Party of Portugal. They stick with a very traditional Orthodox language. One of their ideas is that the mass of the communist movement did not start with Gorbachev and the Perestroika, but started with the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, with the Khrushchev denouncement of the Stalinist crimes. They manage, these 2 parties, other are about 1% and less, but these 2 parties managed to get between 5 and 10% at the national elections. Both of them are represented in the European Parliament. Then you have a third current. These are parties of a left socialist or left green character, so as Die Linke in Germany, which is able, and this is its historic achievement, undeniable historic achievement, to combine different traditions, communist traditions, socialist traditions, social democratic, left social democratic traditions, to a new form of a political party, accepting the plurality of trends and current inside of it. And although the consensus in the party is that they want to transcend capitalism, that they want another society, there is much disagreement and much debate amongst them what were the main feature of this alternative society. What's about democracy? What kind of democracy? How to combine participatory democracy with representative democracy? What's the role of feminism in an alternative socialist project? How can you cherish the independent role of trade unions and social movements in the model of transition? And there you have a broad range of attitudes and positions and proposals. And then you have a fourth current. These are renewed communist parties, as the Communist Party in France, as the Communist Party in Austria, as the Rifondazione Comunista in Italy, as the Communist Party of the Czech Republic, and so on and so forth. And their main message is, yes, we are stemming from a communist tradition. Yes, we hold these positive ideals. At the same time, we denounce Stalinism as a crime towards the societies and towards our own movements. In brackets, I want to say this because this is of biographical importance for me. Victims in the Stalinist Gulag of members of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Austria are more than the victims in the concentration camps and in the jails of the Nazis. Imagine this, that the Communist Party of Austria lost more Central Committee members in the Gulag than in the concentration camps. So these parties try to deal with this. They promote an anti-capitalist agenda, but mainly they think that socialism is a transformative process which consists in the change of ownership, in the change of social structure, and in the change of political power, which has to represent the wishes of the majority of the populations. And the latter two formations, namely the left socialists and the newly formed Communist Party, they went together in the Party of the European Left, which represents 27 parties on the European scale of 22 European countries. And if you ask me for my personal opinion on the question of communism and socialism, yes, of course, we are parties and movements striving to overcome capitalism. But I would say, as Marx said in the German ideology, for us communism is not a state of things once established, but it is a process in which the real critics of the present society takes place. So I see communism as a way of profound changing the society, a way which I want to go together with other political forces, which implies that I will change many of the views which I have at the moment when I start this process. So I strive for an open, radical change of society. But yes, of course, capitalism cannot and must not be the end of history. That's what we are about, what our parties, our movements are all about. There is no difference on this point.
Just a footnote, too. Let's remember, the parties in power, whether Sarkozy in France or Merkel in Germany or Obama here, what are they offering? They're offering a long-term decline. That's what they're offering. A current crisis being used to impose an austerity, to be imposing cutbacks. Every one of the 50 states in the United States is in a fiscal crisis, virtually every city and town. That means combinations of rising taxes and cutbacks of services. We have 15 million unemployed. I understand that there's frustration that we on the left do not have a clear program, a clear idea. But our adversaries, they may have a clear idea, but that clear idea is a damaging, long-term curtailment of everything that has come to be expected by workers in the United States and in Europe. The rage of the Tea Party is the rage of people who figured that out. And they may blame immigrants, but what they're angry about is, as they say it in their rallies, this is not the country we used to live in. They're exactly right. And it don't look good either. So the left faces also an adversary who is presiding over something that is creating the audience for the left. And there's no end in sight of this. Okay, in the time we have met, were there other people who wanted to raise a question, make a comment, draw Walter out on another dimension of the European left or what it might mean for the United States? I cannot forbear saying that I'm jealous as an American. I'm jealous that the Communist Party of Portugal can get 10% of the vote all the time. That 1 out of 8 Germans voted for a party that calls itself the left. Wow. What? That the French are going about closing down everything on the 7th of September in a massive protest of what the government is doing, and that millions and millions of people will be involved in that. And I mean that. That is an extraordinary, whatever else the weaknesses of that left are, that's an extraordinary state of affairs for an American to think about and to contemplate. Comments, questions? Yes, sir. Come up.
Hello, I'm Savith. I'm at the New School. I have a question. How does the European left, and I don't know whether you can speak specifically to Austria or in the different countries, articulate their vision to an ordinary citizen? Like, how are the ideas, like, you know, in America, the idea is that everybody can become wealthy, and that if you work hard and if you play by the system, that it will happen for you. And it's a very tantalizing idea. Is there an alternate idea? I mean, I know that there is, but how are those ideas articulated to individuals in society who may not be radical?
Hi, my name's Stephen. I'm a former undergraduate student, currently doing activism on a volunteer basis while still looking for employment. I'm wondering if you can speak to as to whether the European left has had to fight the extreme right and how the left in the US can pick up some lessons from what the European left has had to deal with in light of the Tea Party in the US.
Building on what he just said, I lived in Italy for a while. I was a member of Rifondazione there, and they've disappeared as a force on the Italian left. And it seems like their organizing tactics and the tactics of the Italian Communist Party have been adopted by the right in Italy. Is that a European-wide phenomenon, and the Lega specifically? Are there any experiences in Europe where the left has been able to reclaim the more community organizing aspects, not only the political and not trade union necessarily, but more on the neighborhood level? And is that a movement forward over there, and is that being contemplated there? So.
Mm-hmm. Well, how does the left connect, the political left connect to ordinary people if they are not radical ones? I think this is the main political, social and cultural difference between the US and Europe. Because the core of this connection between the left, its ideals, and the ordinary people is the social state. And this offensive against the social state is not about reducing the expenses for the social state by 20% or 30%, and it's not about reducing the pensions, as in the Greek case, by 30 and 40%. The question is destroying the idea that a society is based on solidarity redistribution, meaning that in the ordinary payoff system which we have, the current generation agree that they pay for the pensions of their elderly. That the society is based on the idea that, of course, we have differences in wage levels, but it is good and not bad that these differences are somehow evened by state redistribution. The Europeans of the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s may have had different ideas on how equal the level of wages should be, but they agreed on the idea that democracy has to do with equality, with equal access to public health, with the guarantee that when you go into pension, that you are not dropping into nothing, that there is the state who takes care for that you can live your life decently. And this system has its weak aspects and its blind spots, because it did not consider the migrants and it did not consider the women. And that's why it has to be changed. But it has not to be demolished. And the trade unions have to be aware of the necessity that if they are not able to represent the demands of the women in order to change the social system, they work in the hands of those who want to demolish the system by saying, look, not even the women have equal rights. Everybody can become a millionaire in case he works hard. We establish equal rights. And that a third or a fourth or 40% of the population can not survive under these conditions, well, that's the price of equality. And Europe was based on another idea on how society should function. And this is the cultural content of the struggle in which we are in. And this has to do with that, how the left has changed society in the class struggles of the last decades and how it has to defend this heritage. And by the way, you will not find a single document, let's say of the Norwegian or the Swedish trade unions saying in the 50s, we want to establish a welfare state. What they said was we want to have socialism. And by saying we want to have socialism, they achieved the welfare state. That they then agreed on retreating from the goal of socialism is another question. But what we can learn of this is only a labor movement and only a left which strives to transcend capitalist society can effectively defend the situation of the people in the capitalist society. And that's why there is an organic linkage between a transformative radical agenda and, let's say, a reformist trade unionist agenda, and the one cannot exist without the other. And that's why it's such a drama that the political left is so divided in Europe, because even if the trade unions are powerful and mighty, the moral, psychological relation, the cultural relation of power in the society is affected by the lack of a coherent social strategy transcending capitalism as a system. And that's why we need the political left as such. One thing...
Just a footnote. It was so dramatic. When I was in France last month, to hear a debate on the television one evening in which a spokesperson for the what's called in France le patronat, the business elite that runs a society, explaining the need for individual freedom, and a representative of the CGT, the big trade union movement, and he was clearly a communist, just sat there and smirked and smiled while this businessman was doing his thing. And then he stood up, and there was a live audience. There were maybe 300 people. And with a big smile on his face, he knew what he was doing. He asked his audience, do you want to hold on to the law that gives every French worker 5 weeks of paid vacation, or do you not? And in that moment, he won the debate. The very people who were nodding to a certain way to the ideology of individual everything, freedom, they liked that. But when the unionists said, what this amounts to is you will be very free and you will not get your 5 weeks of paid vacation, debate over. He won, and you could see on the face of the businessman that he hadn't prepared properly. He hadn't won that struggle. It's that, I think, what Walter's talking about. The left represents what the society has become, what it gives everybody, what guarantees and supports it provides for everyone's life. And when all the talk about the freedom and so forth is done, it's about taking all that away. And that's part of what this issue is.
And then I wanted to say something on the extreme right. One of these personal decisions which I took during the stay in the United States was that I want to have a closer look on the Tea Party. I don't know it as well enough as I can make a real comparison. I only can say that one particularity of the extreme right in Europe is, it may like it or it may like it not, it is connected with the heritage of Nazi fascism, and it cannot disconnect from this. So Europe has its experiences with the extreme right. And what they actually try now is to change this very broad sentiment in the societies step by step by targeting different groups of the society, the Muslims saying, well, they have this burqa, we need a law forbidding people to appear with a burqa in public spaces. We have to forbid that they have mosques because they are creating parallel societies. Of course, this has then to do with the war against terrorism, with the permanent fear that somebody who speaks a language which is not generally known in the society has evil plans, prepares plots and things like this. But at the end of the day, it always comes out to the point, firstly, we are a white race. Secondly, we deserve the privileges which we have. And thirdly, if those guys coming from other countries and other continents do not accept the way of living in which we are in, then we suppress them by means of the state and by police terror. And this has been the history, the previous history, and the previous experience at our continent. And this is a capital which the left has to use. We have to remind people what once happened and what is possible. Yes, another world is possible in a positive sense, but it is also possible in a barbarian sense. And also this does not imply moral questions only. This has a very concrete political content. I would not subscribe to the idea that the process of the European unification is irreversible. It is not. There are strong currents in the different European countries which say, we Germans, why should we deal with the debts of the Greeks? What have we to do with these guys in Spain, in Portugal, not working rightly? Our banks have to pay for them and so on and so forth. We have our German mark. Let's establish our German mark in order to get rid of them. This would lead then in a political situation in Europe in which Europe is again separated, divided in nation states that would not change anything on the capitalist character of the societies. And although I understand very well that the current crisis has to do with the failure of the European Union to implement economic policy against the crisis, channeling money from above to the bottom of the society, which has to do with overcoming the over-accumulation crisis. I don't want now to go in this theoretical topic about the structures of the crisis, but this ignorance of the European elites towards the fears of people, what may happen to the social state, what may happen to their future, what may happen to the education of their kids, and so on and so forth. This has to do with a growing anger and has to do with a growing nationalist sentiments in a couple of European societies. So that's why I think that the agenda of the European left has to be a European agenda. We have to ask how the European Union can be forced to a social change of its politics, how it can be democratized in different ways. And this obviously also implies changes in the structure of the European left. We have a couple of parties like the Greek Communist Party or the Communist Party of Portugal saying, let's get out of the European Union. Maybe the Greeks could go out, maybe the Portuguese could go out. I doubt that this would be a good step for the people. But what would happen if the Germans decide to go out? That would be then a European structure very similar to the European structure we had before the Second World War. So things in Europe are difficult and dangerous. Yes, there is a European left. Yes, it represents, I think, 6 million of voters at the European elections. Yes, it is represented on the municipal level, in the neighborhood. Yes, it does good things for people, it helps things. For example, there was a survey in France in which at the last elections the Communist Party got about 5%. But at that survey it turned out that 40% of the French said when they were asked if they would prefer to have a communist neighbor in their apartment house, they said yes. We would appreciate to have a communist neighbor because the communist neighbors are well known for defending people in the very concrete problems of the lives which they have. Yes, these are good things on the European left. At the same time, there are very, very big and sincere questions which we have to tackle with. I would say we have to reinvent the European left. We have to reinvent it as a European force. We have good examples. Portugal, not only the Communist Party, also the left bloc. We have the good example in Germany. We have good examples in Scandinavia. But we have also, as it was mentioned, not so good example as, for example, in Italy, where it turned out that the leadership of the party was not able to cope with the challenge suddenly being asked to get into a government. What you can do about it if you're asked to go into a government? It's complicated, but this, I think, we will sort out. Not we, but the big collective of our parties. Yes, you were asking on means of communication, if I understood you right. There are, I think, 10 or maybe 7 daily appearing newspapers of left and communist parties in Europe. There are dozens of weeklies. There are radio stations, TV stations. There are opportunities. But at the same time, it's a difficult situation in which we are in, and there is a transitional process which we have to undergo. But at the end of the day, we are leftists, we are pessimists in the analysis, but optimists of the deeds. And that's why I think we will sort it out anyway. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you all very much for coming. 2 small points. A question was asked, a good question about debt. One of the reasons individual debt doesn't play the role in European politics that it does here is that the experience in different European countries is radically different. German people do not take on personal debt the way people in other countries do. People in Ireland and in Spain undertook debt for housing in a way that other European countries didn't. So it's a very variable situation. It's not the general indebtedness that exists, for example, in the United States, so it plays a different role. More importantly, one of the things that I wanted to thank the Brecht Forum for is that, you know, we need each other. The problems of the left in the United States and Europe are problems that we would all be better off if we understood each other better, if we talked to each other better, if we had meetings like this. The isolation, and that's true of the Europeans vis-a-vis what happens in the United States as well as the reverse, is something that weakens both of us. And we have a lot to teach each other, and I think it's very important that the Brecht Forum saw fit to organize an evening where people who know and are interested in learning about the left in Europe could come together, hear what had to be said, think about the answers, and take the integration of our very similar struggles another step. The big businesses, the big banks of Europe and America have conferences and meetings all the time. Because I'm an economics professor, I've been to those. Those are well organized. Those have been going on for 30 years. They coordinate. They've been coordinating how to handle this crisis all the time. It's the trade unions that have a hard time getting together, and it's the left that has a hard time getting together. So this is an important step in a process of interaction that we need a lot more of. So thank you all for coming.